Hey everybody, it's your host, Diana Chen, and you're listening to an episode of Minihash, a condensed episode of Rehash where we do a deep dive into one focused topic with a past guest. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of Minihash. Today we have Jimmy Chang with us to recap EthCC in Brussels. Jimmy first appeared on Rehash all the way back in season 4, episode 9, which aired on April 13th, 2023. And fun fact, Jimmy and I actually did an EthCC recap 3 years ago of EthCC 2021 when we were both working at Unstoppable Domains as coworkers. And that is still out there on YouTube. You can go and find it if you're curious. And it was definitely different times back then. Some of the things were a bit cringe, for lack of better words, but it's always a good time to do these things. It's fun to look back and see how the space has evolved, see how the things that were being talked about a lot at EthCC 2021 are still relevant or not today. So to start off, I'm curious to just get your overall take on what were the overall vibes at EthCC this year in Brussels, especially compared to, if you can remember at all, 3 years ago, EthCC 2021 when we last recapped it, or just years past. How did the overall vibe feel this year?
I would say it's hard for me to say what the vibe was in 2021. I imagine it was euphoric because it was on that post-COVID wave where people were meeting in person again, or even sometimes for the first time for all of the quarantine, people that entered the space. So I imagine that was just a really, really good time. But even if I compare this year's EthCC to years past, whether it be 21, 22, or 23, I've sadly been in attendance for all of them. I would say this is probably the worst vibe in the sense of there was a tiredness. And I think it had to do with the market and I think the current state of things. I think it also had to do with the location switch to Brussels. But I would say if I had to summarize EthCC this year in one word, I would just say tired, honestly. Not even physically, mentally just fed up.
Yeah, people in the chat are agreeing with you that the vibes were pretty off this year. People also seem to very much dislike Brussels as a location for the conference. I was not at EthCC, but your description of that overall sounds like kind of the vibe in the space in general. So that's not too surprising to hear. What would you say were your main takeaways from EthCC this year?
How negative do you want me to be?
Just be honest.
Okay. I'm pretty biased, honestly, because I definitely think I'm one of the coercive voices that are kind of recognizing some of the issues and some of the ennui that we're experiencing within crypto, a little SAT word there. So my takeaways were predominantly negative, I would say. But I'll try to add a more comprehensive view, just from my observations of other people, of other attendees. So I would say there's two main negative takeaways and then one positive takeaway. The big negative takeaway was the fragmentation of EthCC this year. And I think that kind of manifested in a number of ways. One of it was, I think this was the lowest attendance percentage of the EthCC main event versus side events of all of EthCC, right? I think probably if I had to throw numbers, maybe 30% or less, 25% of anyone who was at Brussels for EthCC actually attended the main conference. And I went to the main conference and I very much felt that the attendance felt very sparse. And I think a lot of the main conversations were happening on side events, right? And I think this year side events came in full force. There were a lot of very, very expensive and high caliber side events. We had a modular summit, of course, thrown by Celestia and Maven 11, and every L2 had, of course, their own day. And those were, really, really good events with lots of energy. But I think that led to a lot of fragmentation, right? It was Brussels is not too big of a city, but in order to get a very big menu, you kind of have to be in the outskirts. And so a lot of moving around to different events. A lot of smaller projects were excited to throw their own event or encouraged to throw their own event. And so there definitely felt like there was an overabundance of side events this year, which leads to social fragmentation, which is kind of the symbolism of the social fragmentation, even liquidity fragmentation or user experience fragmentation that we're seeing with a lot of proliferation of things this year. So that was kind of like a major takeaway. I think the second takeaway is there's a bit of saturation of infrastructure as a dialogue and also as just like a general narrative. And so lots of L2s, lots of chains, lots of ZK projects, account obstruction projects. And I think like the roast or like the joke that everyone was making either on panels or off stage were like, where are the apps, right? It's like, we need apps. But like no one really knows where these apps are. And so I was at the closing ceremony of Modular Summit, and Eric Wall of Taproot Wizards was alongside Mert from Helios. I always forget his project name. They were asking builders, they were like, name 10 apps. And like people were like, sitting there, they couldn't even name 10 apps. So there's the two negatives, and I'll pause if you want to hear the positive, or we can riff on the negative.
Yeah, just real quick, I did see those photos on Twitter from the actual conference. I don't know if it was the main stage, but it looked to be like some kind of main stage area, and there were like 2 people in the seats, 3 people in the seats in this like huge room. Was that accurate of most of the talks, would you say? Or was that kind of just like a really extreme case that somebody posted and it ended up getting a lot of traction on Twitter?
As with any social media, it's kind of like fake and like overblown, right? It's like, oh, you're taking a picture of the main stage, like right as it opens at like 9:30 after like a whole night of thunderstorms in a venue that's at the outskirts of town, right? But that's not to say that like, at the peak of these events were like all butts on seats, right? I would say like at the peak of any event, maybe 50% of butts were on seats. And that's for like heavy hitter, like Vitalik talks, right? And so, yeah, I think it's obviously an exaggeration, but hit kind of the point that everyone wanted to make in kind of like the internet way of just like blowing things out of proportion, but like still being true.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured. Obviously, like it's a photo, it wasn't photoshopped, it was actually taken, so that was the case at one point. As you were talking about that, like I was gonna ask what your thoughts are on this phenomenon that seems to have happened where these conferences have become so side event heavy. And Rachel asked this in the chat too. She said, I'd be curious about Jim's overall thoughts about conferences. It seems like it's becoming more and more common for people to favor side events over conference events. For example, ETH Denver, Consensus, EthCC are all prime examples, plus the overall discontent for the actual conference and often the locations as well. I was thinking about this as everybody was at EthCC and posting, you know, just mostly negative things about it. Do you think it's necessarily a bad thing that conferences are shifting towards the side event heavy thing? Part of me wants to say that, you know, if we can get all of these people together in the same city for anything, that there's some positive that can come out of that, even if people aren't going to the conference itself. On the other hand, I don't know, it seems like wasteful to like have this conference, or it seems, you know, too kind of a slap in the face to speakers as well, when speakers are signing up for these, working so hard on their talks and going to these events, and there's like 2 people sitting in the audience listening to their talk. Like that doesn't feel good from the speaker side as well. So curious what your take is on that.
I still think like my favorite conference that I've been to in crypto was MCon in 2021, where it was very, very light on the main programming, and they kind of let a ecosystem of additional things just happen around Denver. And of the programming, it was like curated high quality. Like it was really the only event that I've ever seen where the main speaker slot was actually a one-on-one interview, right? You had someone who like knew their shit interviewing someone else who knew their shit. And like that was like a high quality conversation. It wasn't like a talk, or it wasn't like a panel of like 6 people, right? And so to answer your question, I do think conferences have at this point, I think, fallen to a point where they're running the same playbook over and over again, and people's interests have either shifted or they are less interested on like what has always been, right, on these like panels and these like talks that like don't really say anything. And so I think it's okay to like relinquish the main character energy of a conference in service of that ecosystem. I do think the conference is like a forcing function or like a shelling point for people to just like come together, right? Or else it's like free for all. Everyone's like, oh, I want to go to Barcelona, I want to go to Zermatt or what have you. So that is helpful. But I do think like, At the end of the day, I want the events teams to like give people what they want. And I think people are starting to be very vocal about what they want, and what is being offered is not really what they want. So it's like shrinking it, offering much higher quality content, and also allowing like other side events to like just do their thing basically.
Do you think that the format of, first of all, totally agree with you about MCon. I missed MCon 21, but I was at MCon 22 and loved it. Do you think, though, that the format and the quality and everything about MCon, do you think that that's possible at scale, like at such a large scale as EthCC? Because MCon's tiny, right? Like as even compared to other crypto conferences, it's pretty small. And then especially compared to something like EthCC, it is tiny. So for a conference as big as EthCC or ETH Denver or something like that, like how would we even make it better?
It's hard to be prescriptive. I think the best thing to do is just to like have a forum for dialogue on like what people want from like the events teams, and like offering that, right? I totally agree. Like MCon probably doesn't work for the scale of, 10,000 plus attendees in aggregate, but I think there are like learnings from that, right? The feedback that I often get from the main conference is like, one, it's, not worth it because the same speakers speak at side events, and two, it's expensive, right? It's like, the layperson does not want to spend like 250 to 300 euros for a ticket. And so like lowering the price, lowering the scale of it, just like offering something that maybe like other side events can't, in the form of like really, really high caliber curated content. And like at the end of the day, what does that look like? That's where the dialogue comes in, right? It's like offering things that people want to see. Like, I think, hard to say, but at the end of EthCC this year, they announced that next year they're going to be in Cannes, which for folks that don't know where that is, it's a small beach town in the south of France, close to Nice, and where they host a film festival. It's a really small town, and there's no airport. So it's like logistically, it's going to be really, really hard to get to, and also really hard to book hotels and book events and et cetera, et cetera. And so my initial reaction, and I think I, echo a lot of other people's reactions, is like, where was the dialogue on this, right? Or maybe there was one and we missed it. Because like that is just going to be really, really difficult for a lot of people to go to. And so I think that's just like indicative of, I think, a broader kind of issue that I see.
Yeah, well, maybe now that they've heard all the negative feedback about having the conference there, they'll rethink the location and pick a better place for everybody to convene. Who knows? But yeah, I totally agree with that. There's no dialogue around it, especially in a space that's so focused on decentralization. You would think that there would be some sort of like decentralized decision making when it comes to conferences this big that they want everybody to attend. But another good point, too, that you made and that Rachel said in the chat as well is that it seems like a lot of the people that go to these conferences, the big ones at least, like EthCC, for example, are people who get paid by their company to go. So the company has some corporate sponsorship. They're paying tons of money. But these aren't the people that necessarily really want to go, or like want to go for the same reasons that, maybe you and I want to go, for like the vibes or to hang out with people, or for like the quality of the talks and things like that. People who are getting sponsored by their companies to go are maybe going because it's their job. They're getting paid to go. They're getting a free trip out of it. But I wonder if that's going to shift in the future to conferences like EthCC just becoming these corporate functions versus other smaller ones like MCon, or shout out Oasis on Chain to Steph, who's in the chat, that people who want the cozier spaces and the different vibes are going to go to those smaller conferences instead.
Yeah. I didn't know Stefan was in the chat. What's up, Stefan? Big fan of On-Chain Oasis. Excited for the next iteration next year.
Yeah, I'll be there. Are you going?
I want to. I think I pinged Stefan on this right as I was leaving EthCC. Like, I think this is like the perfect wave to capitalize on for like cozier events that are like focused on like consumer, right? Like apps, and also like activations and onboarding of like non-crypto people, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a large like yearning for that within the space right now.
Yeah, quick plug too, if people want to learn more about Oasis on Chain, we did just recently release a Minihash episode, our second one, that was all about Oasis on Chain. So if you want to learn more there, Stefan spends a whole Minihash episode talking about that, so you can go listen to that. Going back then to your overall takeaways, let's get to your positive takeaway.
So the positive takeaway is that things work now, right? Like things are working. Like all the things that we've been talking about for so long, like the roll-up centric roadmap, like not paying like $50 to do a transaction, like not needing to know what a private key is. Like all of these like things that we've been complaining about in the last cycle are actually getting built. And it's still slightly janky, but like the raw ingredients are there to like build together if people need it, right? Like I don't really use Ethereum mainnet anymore. Even if I did, it would probably be like less than $1 for an approval or a simple send. And if I use an L2, it would be a cent, right? 2 cents, like something that I'd forget about, right? And so we're no longer complaining about spending hundreds of dollars for like block space. Like it's abundant, right? Which is really great. And so I think we hit the point that we've all been complaining, and now we're like, wow, we really thought apps would come if like we did this thing. And now we're realizing that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, that is a really good takeaway. In terms of the things that are working, like where do you think people are spending most of their time and efforts nowadays in terms of categories of apps or categories of infra? And were there any categories that people talked about a lot and that was surprising to you? Like you weren't expecting that to get so much coverage.
I think all the original cast of characters are still in play in terms of like verticals of apps. It's like DeFi, RWA is almost like its own thing at this point. SocialFi, gaming, still like creator economy experiences. And so those are still very much, I think, the core names in town. One thing that was surprising to me was DePIN is certainly getting more attention now. And so, you know, decentralized infrastructure, I actually don't know what the P is.
I was just going to ask that.
Decentralized physical infrastructure.
Okay.
And so things like, you know, Helium for like Wi-Fi and Nemo for like car rentals and stuff like that. There's been a lot of excitement on like building numbers of things. Like I'm seeing like on-chain Uber happen again, right? Where it's like drivers want to own the network that they're driving for. I'm like, okay, maybe, like go for it. That's fine, right? At least it's better than another, you know, shared sequencing layer. There were some cool like social experiments happening. There was like a crypto matchmaking service that I thought was really cool. I don't know if I'm allowed to say who did it or what the name was, so I apologize if I'm not sharing it right now. That was really cool.
It's okay. Can you describe how it worked and what were the on-chain components?
So I wasn't really a part of it, but basically it was like a game where people were matched with their like sweethearts, I think it was called, or I don't know, something like that. And there's like clues on like where to find them, like IRL around Brussels. So that was kind of interesting. Kind of like Crypto the Game-esque, right? It's like some sort of like coordination, but more on like the romantic lens.
And they're called soulmates. People in the chat are saying soulmates. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not the expert of this. And so there was that. And then there's Chipped that Winnie was doing, which was really, really cool. I also sadly was not a part of that. Although I'm not, you know, like I love painting my nails. I'm not like, you know, I think it's dope. I just didn't have time to do that. So that was really cool, right? It's like you have this like NFC chip on your fingernails and it like can resolve to an address, and I had some couple folks show that to me, so that was really cool. So there's awesome stuff, like people are experimenting, right? They're on the ground, boots on the ground, trying to create like unique experiences, and I respect that a lot.
Yeah, nice. Chipped, obviously we're all big fans of. We had Winnie on the podcast last season to talk about it. I hadn't heard of the crypto matchmaking service. It sounds interesting. Anything with like online dating or anything makes me nervous when you talk about putting it on chain. So that's why I was just curious about the on-chain component of that and how that worked. But maybe they're just pulling on-chain data from these people's wallets to match them or something like that. I don't know. I'd be interested to know more. But anyway, going back to more of like the technical side or the infra side, what were the major categories or talking points there?
So it's hard for me to have this comprehensive framework, but off the cuff, there were people talking about roll-ups, non-roll-up scaling, general like ZK technology, whether it be on the proving side or on the actual proof generation or even like the compression side. There's shared sequencers. I think shared sequencers were kind of like on the ground, like Espresso and we're definitely had a lot of cool events and activations and community building efforts. There was a lot of talk on like privacy as it pertained to like secure enclaves or like TEs. And so using this kind of like centralized, although encrypted, like off-chain enclave to like preserve privacy as opposed to like doing any like fancy cryptography thing. It's kind of like a intermediary technology that's like good enough for what people want, right? And there's a lot of debate on like whether it was good, whether it was not. On that piece, there's also like something called like they're talking about like different like encryption methods, basically, as it pertained to privacy as well. So that was a really big conversation. There was a lot of talk on like novel consensus mechanisms, like parallel EVM or parallel chains or alternative VMs like Movement and Confluent were on the ground as well. So lots of talk on just that whole side of it, basically. I'm sure like I could put together into some stack or what have you. Chain abstraction was really big. That's something that we were kind of proponents of, which is effectively like a interstitial layer that abstracts away all of the shit I just talked about, basically. And so like app developers can just build apps and have it be multi-chain, and users can use apps and have it be multi-chain. And what that looks like from like a wallet perspective, what does it look like from a kind of abstraction perspective, from a solver perspective, from a chain perspective. So there was a lot of conversation around that.
Were you able to attend the hackathon portion of the conference at all?
No, I didn't go to the ETH Global Hackathon, unfortunately. I really, really wish I did, because I felt like EthCC minus the hackathon was not really Belgian heavy at all. Like, in fact, I probably spent most of my time talking to Americans from New York City, sadly, given that I live there and am an American. So that was disheartening. But I heard that a lot of Belgians attended the hackathon, which is cool because that's the point of why we go to these places, right? To highlight the community and onboard the community.
Yeah, I don't know who this is, but some anonymous person just popped in the chat and said Jim looks so tired, like ECC took all his energy. Maybe from the side events?
I did get the EthCC PO-op, so I was a little sick for the past few days. So just still
not
recovering
COVID
from
though,
that.
right?
I don't think so. I haven't, been responsible enough to find a test, unfortunately.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, because throwback to our ECC 2021 recap when you got COVID, and that was still during quarantine time. So didn't you get stuck in Paris for like a week or longer after the conference?
Yeah, I was in Paris for 2 weeks, just in a small windowless Airbnb, eating Uber Eats, which is, that's basically what I do in New York, so not that different.
Not that different. Speaking of side events, what were your favorite side events?
So I think this year, and I talked about this on a tweet, but there were a lot of like small, cozy events this year where it was like 20 people max, right? And sometimes they're for dinner, sometimes they're like presentations or what have you. So those are really nice because, I think everyone there wanted to either talk about the main subject at hand or they're people that people wanted to form business partnerships with. So it was helpful. So that like as a category, I loved, right?
Yeah.
Although there are a lot of them. So maybe less next time would be cool. But I think my favorite event was an event thrown by the Fastlane team called Unaligned Day. And it was a full day of talks with really, really smart and respected people. And the whole premise was to just like point out a problem and offer no solution, like no shilling of anyone's projects whatsoever. Just like say something is wrong. And that was like kind of therapeutic, I think. And so people came up and it leaned technical, right? There was a lot of talk on like if shared security is a meme, right? All these restaking primitives and if proof of stake is long-term viable. But there's also things like, there was a talk, I sadly didn't attend this, but it was like crypto has bad founders, or like the caliber of talent for founders is really low. And It was just that, right? It was just like a 15-minute rant where it was like, yeah, these people are not good. And that was kind of therapeutic, right? So I liked it. I look forward to more events like that. I also went to a sound bath, and that was really cool. I think half the people just fell asleep, but I didn't because I'm built different. And I like meditated for like a good hour and a half. That was really, really rejuvenating.
Xerox Gym built different. Last thing, looking ahead to ECC 2025. So we already know the location for ECC 2025. Other than that, though, what are your predictions for ECC next year? Like, what do you think are going to be the big topics that are talked about then? Any other predictions?
I think, and I hope a year from now, there will be this like S-tier echelon of apps that just come out of this refocus of, community priority and also like investment priority. And they might have infra components to it, or it might just be like a pure app. But I think that would be like the shining stars of the conference, so to speak. Like, honestly, I don't think there was enough talk about Hyperliquid as like a full stack trading experience. And they're kind of like running the perfect playbook, I would say, from like a product and go-to-market perspective for a trading app, and still kind of like on the up ramp, hopefully. So, them as like a main character and some other new stalwarts would be kind of my hope for next year.
Nice. Any other apps like that people should have their eye on?
Honestly, less apps and more
users on the apps?
No, I mean, like ecosystems. So I spent a lot of time in the Telegram ecosystem, the Ton ecosystem. Sorry, not Telegram, the open network, the Ton ecosystem. So that is a very, very interesting slice of the crypto ecosystem, I would say, because they're viewing things in a completely different lens. For all the flack that I think SY and Jason and the rest of the Story Protocol team got with their announcement and their summit, I don't agree with the way they're going about it in terms of burning bridges up front, but they feel strongly about building for some niche that no one else is building for. So I do hope to see something exciting happening from their ecosystem. Those are kind of like two things that are just popped into my brain just now.
Yeah, very cool. Any final thoughts on EthCC as we wrap up this recap?
EthCC, I think, needs to change, honestly. And maybe like the smaller city will offer that to it. I think like it lost the plot a little bit. And my perspective, the plot used to be, it's like the European conference, right? When I went years past, I felt just like the European builder community come, especially the French community. And like that was empowering, and I got to learn a lot about what they prioritize and what they're building and like how they build it and the different cultural differences. I felt less of that this year. But candidly, I think every conference has kind of like lost that differentiator, so to speak, outside of like it's in a different city in a different time of the year. And I would want that to like come back basically through like activations and like curation events. Otherwise it's like, I close my eyes, I'm in different places, it's the same thing 3 to 4 times a year, right? That's not really why I go to these things. And I'm actually like considering scaling back, attending some of these as well.
Why do you think that has happened? Like, what do you think caused people to lose the plot, and how do we get it back?
I think one thing is that people just love conferences, right? Like what you said, it's like the perfect storm of incentives. You get expense travel to a different place and see your friends and do the BD and like have a video of you giving a talk at a big stage. It's enough of a value prop, even though it's like a perverse one, that like everyone just goes now, right? That didn't used to be the case. It used to feel more regional. And so now they just like start to feel like the same, right? Like DEF CON used to feel special in the sense that, or even like DEF Connect used to feel special because it was like the global conference, right? But they're all the global conference now. So it's less differentiated. And I think like every year you want to make it better, right? It's like bigger, better, it's growth, right? The capitalistic mindset. But you have the same team with the same number of people, right? This is the common feedback I get or I hear from event organizers, same number of people, bigger scale. And so you kind of have to take shortcuts. You're like, oh, the same thing, same sponsors, same people, again, just bigger, right? And I think we need more of like a reimagination sometimes.
Well, hopefully we will see some of our friends at MCon this year and at Oasis on Chain earlier next year for people that prefer the cozier environment. Otherwise, maybe they'll make maybe they'll actually get some user feedback on EthCC before it happens next year, and they'll get, some input from the crowd. So we can only hope. But thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining me on this recap. It was fun to recap it with you, just like the good old days. I'm glad you don't have COVID this time and you're not quarantined in a windowless hotel room. So we're up only. Really appreciate you taking the time. Go enjoy your holiday in Italy. Thanks everybody for tuning in on the live stream, and we will see you again soon with another episode of Rehash.